Back in August of 2020, I woke up one morning feeling a strange sense of unease. Moments later, I passed out, and when I came to, I was surrounded by a horrifying sight. Blood, my blood, was everywhere. Panic set in as I was rushed to the hospital, where I learned that I was teetering on the edge of death. A massive stomach ulcer had formed, and I was bleeding internally at an alarming rate. My stomach had filled with blood, and the situation was dire. Before being rushed into emergency surgery, fear gripped me like never before. I did not know if I was going to survive. As I lay there trying to come to terms with the gravity of my situation, a woman entered my room. She looked at me with an intensity that I will never forget. She asked, "Are you doing okay?" I managed to say, "Yeah," though I did not feel anywhere near okay. Then she asked, "Are you scared?" I admitted, "Yes, I am." Now, I am not a religious man, but in that moment, when she asked if she could pray for me, I was so terrified of the thought of never seeing my kids again that I agreed. "Yes, please," I said, desperate for anything that might help. I do not remember the words of the prayer, but I remember the calm that followed. She finished praying and told me, "Everything is going to be okay. I will see you later." Then she left, and I never saw her again. I spent 17 long days in that hospital, and during that time, I had plenty of moments to think about what had happened. That is when it hit me. She was not dressed like the nurses or any of the other hospital staff. She was dressed entirely in black. To this day, I cannot shake the feeling that something was off. Who was she? What was she? I had not been given any pain medication or anything that could have caused a hallucination. It was real and it still haunts me. After I was discharged from the hospital, life seemed to return to some semblance of normalcy. But that encounter with the woman in black stayed with me. I found myself replaying those moments over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of it all. I could not shake the feeling that there was something more to it, something beyond my understanding. A few weeks after I got home, strange things started happening around the house. At first, it was small things. Objects would be moved from where I had left them, lights would flicker for no apparent reason, and I would hear faint whispers when no one else was around. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that it was just my imagination, a side effect of the trauma I had been through. But deep down, I knew something was not right. One night, as I was lying in bed, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The room grew cold, and I could see my breath in the air. I tried to move, but it was like my body was frozen in place. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw her, the woman in black, standing in the doorway. Her face was obscured by shadows, but I knew it was her. She did not say anything, just stood there watching me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I could not do anything except lie there, paralyzed with fear. After what felt like an eternity, she finally turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. The moment she was gone, the room returned to normal. The temperature rose and I could move again. I sat up, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I could not believe what I had just seen. Was it real, or was I losing my mind? I knew I could not keep this to myself any longer. The next day, I told my wife about what had happened. Marianne listened, her face pale with concern. She did not dismiss my experience, which was a relief, but she did not know what to make of it either. "Maybe you should talk to someone," she suggested, "a priest or a therapist, someone who can help you make sense of all this." I was hesitant, but I knew she was right. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. Whatever was happening to me, it was not going to stop on its own. The encounter with the woman in black had unlocked something, and I feared it was only the beginning. A few days later, I took Marianne's advice and reached out to a local priest. Father Thomas was an older man with kind eyes and a calm demeanor that put me at ease. I had never been much of a churchgoer, but there was something about him that made me feel like I could trust him. I explained everything: the stomach ulcer, the woman in black, and the strange occurrences at home. Father Thomas listened intently, nodding occasionally as I spoke. When I finished, he took a deep breath and said, "You are not the first person to experience something like this. Sometimes when we are close to death, we become more aware of the spiritual world. It is possible that this woman was a spirit, perhaps an angel sent to comfort you, or something else." "Something else?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. There are spirits that do not come from a place of light, he explained. They are drawn to fear and suffering. If you were in a vulnerable state, it is possible that one of these entities could have taken an interest in you. The thought of it made my skin crawl. What can I do? I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Father Thomas leaned forward, his expression serious. First, you need to protect your home. I can come by and bless the house, but you and your wife must also keep your heart strong. Do not let fear take hold, and do not invite darkness in, even unintentionally. Stay away from anything that could attract negative energy, violence, hatred, things like that. I agreed, and we set a time for him to visit the house. When I got home, I told Marianne about what Father Thomas had said. She was supportive, though I could see the worry in her eyes. We both wanted to believe that the blessing would solve everything, but there was a tension in the air that neither of us could ignore. The day of the blessing, Father Thomas arrived with a small bottle of holy water and a cross. He walked through each room of the house, murmuring prayers and sprinkling holy water as he went. Marianne and I followed him, holding hands tightly. When he was finished, he placed the cross on the wall in our living room and said, "Your home is blessed now. Whatever is here should leave." For a few days, things were quiet. I almost started to believe that it was over. But one night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a loud crash from the kitchen. I jumped out of bed and ran to see what had happened. The kitchen table was flipped over, chairs scattered across the floor. And there, in the middle of the chaos, was the woman in black. She stood with her back to me, her presence more terrifying than before. I felt the same paralysis as that night in the bedroom, the same cold fear. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. She slowly turned her head, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of her face, pale, almost ghostly, with dark eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. "Leave us alone," I finally managed to shout, though the words felt weak in the face of whatever she was. The woman in black did not move, did not speak. She simply stared at me for a long moment, then vanished, leaving the kitchen in shambles and my heart racing with fear. I knew then that the blessing had not been enough. Whatever this was, it was not going to leave us alone easily. And as much as I hated to admit it, I was terrified that this was far from over. In the days following the incident in the kitchen, I became increasingly paranoid. Every little noise, every shadow seemed to signal the presence of the woman in black. Sleep became a distant memory. I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, dreading what might come next. Marianne tried her best to comfort me, but I could see the fear growing in her eyes as well. We both knew that something dark was lingering in our home, and it was not going to leave without a fight. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the house, Marianne and I sat in the living room, the TV on, but neither of us really watching. We were both too on edge. The air felt heavy, thick with tension. Suddenly, the lights began to flicker, and a cold draft swept through the room. We exchanged a glance, both knowing what was coming. Before we could react, the TV screen went black, and a low, eerie hum filled the air. The temperature dropped sharply, and the familiar sense of dread settled over us. Then from the hallway, we heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on the walls. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. Marianne grabbed my arm, her grip tight with fear. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I did not have an answer. The tapping grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the living room door. The door creaked open slowly, and there she was, the woman in black. She stood in the doorway, her dark eyes fixed on us. This time, there was no mistaking the malevolence in her gaze. She was not here to comfort, she was here to torment. I could feel the icy grip of fear tightening around my throat, but I forced myself to speak. "Why are you doing this? What do you want?" The woman tilted her head slightly as if considering my question. Then, in a voice that sent chills down my spine, she whispered, "You invited me." I froze, trying to make sense of her words. Invited her? What did that mean? My mind raced, trying to remember if I had done anything that could have brought this upon us. But before I could think of anything, she stepped into the room, her presence overwhelming, suffocating. Marianne and I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The woman in black advanced slowly, her gaze never leaving us, Desperation clawed at my insides. I did the only thing I could think of. I began to pray. The words stumbled out of my mouth, shaky and unsure. But I prayed with everything I had. To my surprise, the woman hesitated. For a brief moment, her dark eyes flickered with something I could not quite identify. Was it fear? Anger? I did not know, but I kept praying. Louder now, more determined. Marianne joined in, her voice trembling but strong. The woman in black let out a low, guttural sound, something between a growl and a scream. The lights in the room burst, plunging us into darkness. But even in the dark, I could feel her presence, could sense her rage. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The cold air lifted, the oppressive atmosphere eased, and the woman was gone. The lights flickered back on, revealing the living room in disarray. Marianne and I stood there, breathing heavily, our hearts pounding. "What just happened?" Marianne whispered, her voice barely audible. "I do not know," I replied, my mind still reeling from the encounter. "But I think we managed to drive her away, at least for now." But even as I said the words, I knew this was not over. The woman in black had been forced to retreat, but I could feel it in my bones. She would be back, and next time, she would not be so easily driven away. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. Every creak in the house, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, set me on edge. I could tell that Marianne was just as rattled, though she tried her best to stay strong for the both of us. We talked about leaving the house, maybe staying with family or friends, but something held us back. It was as if we knew deep down that running away would not solve the problem. Whatever this thing was, it would follow us. One evening, after yet another restless night, I decided to dig deeper into the history of the house. Maybe there was something in its past that could explain what was happening to us. I went to the local library and started sifting through old records and newspapers, hoping to find some clue. Hours passed, and I was just about ready to give up when I stumbled across an old article from the 1920s. The headline read, "Mysterious Death-Plagued Local Family." My heart skipped a beat as I read the story. It told of a family that had lived in our house nearly a century ago, a man, his wife, and their young daughter. According to the article, the wife had fallen gravely ill and died under mysterious circumstances. Shortly afterward, the daughter claimed to have seen a woman in black who would visit her at night. The father, distraught and unable to cope with the loss, eventually took his own life. The article mentioned that the daughter was sent to live with relatives, and there were rumors that the house was cursed. I sat back in my chair, the weight of the discovery pressing down on me. Could this be the same woman in black that was haunting us now? Had she somehow attached herself to this house, tormenting anyone who dared to live here? I took the article home and showed it to Marianne. She read it with a look of growing horror. "What does this mean?" she asked, her voice shaky. "I do not know for sure," I admitted, "but it seems like whatever this is, it has been here for a long time. Maybe it is connected to that family, or maybe it is something even older." "We have to do something," Marianne said, her eyes pleading. "We cannot just sit here and wait for her to come back." She was right. We needed to take action. The blessing from Father Thomas had not been enough, and I knew we had to find another way to protect ourselves. I decided to reach out to a paranormal investigator, someone who might have more experience dealing with this kind of thing. I found a man named Jack Lawson, who had been recommended by several people online. He had a reputation for being no nonsense and getting results, which was exactly what we needed. I called him, and after I explained our situation, he agreed to come to the house the next day. When Jack arrived, I was struck by how ordinary he seemed. Just a regular guy in his late 40s, with a worn leather jacket and a serious expression. But there was something in his eyes, a depth that suggested he had seen things most people could not even imagine. Jack spent the first hour walking through the house, taking readings with various devices, asking us questions and making notes. He was thorough, methodical, and seemed unfazed by the eerie atmosphere that had become all too familiar to us. After his initial assessment, Jack sat down with us in the living room. "There is definitely something here," he said, his tone matter of fact. "It is old and it is powerful. I do not think it is a human spirit. It is something darker, something that feeds on fear." Marianne and I exchanged a worried glance. "What can we do?" I asked. "You have a few options," Jack replied. "You can try another blessing, maybe even an exorcism, but that can be risky if not done properly. Or you can try to banish it yourselves, though that is also dangerous if you are not prepared." "Is there any way to get rid of it for good?" Marianne asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jack hesitated before answering. "Maybe, but it will not be easy. Whatever this entity is, it has a strong connection to this place. You would need to sever that connection, and that usually involves confronting it directly." The thought of facing the woman in black again made my blood run cold, but I knew we could not keep living like this. "We will do whatever it takes," I said, my voice firm. "We just want our lives back." Jack nodded. "All right, I will help you, but you need to understand that this will not be easy, and it might get worse before it gets better. But if you are determined, there is a chance we can end this once and for all." That night, as we prepared for what was to come, I could not help but feel a mix of dread and determination. The woman in black had terrorized us for long enough. It was time to face her, whatever the cost. The next few days were filled with a tense anticipation. Jack had given us a list of preparations, items we needed to gather, prayers to learn, and the mindset to adopt. He warned us that the entity would likely become more aggressive as we drew closer to confronting it, and we had to be ready for anything. Marianne and I spent hours together, going over everything Jack had told us, memorizing the prayers and trying to mentally prepare ourselves. But no amount of preparation could fully calm the fear that gnawed at our insides. The house felt like a ticking time bomb, and we were waiting for it to explode. The night of the confrontation finally arrived. Jack showed up just after sunset, carrying a black duffel bag filled with tools, candles, salt, a small mirror, and several other items that looked like they belonged in a horror movie. His demeanor was serious, but there was a quiet confidence in his eyes that gave me a small measure of comfort. "We need to do this in the room where the activity has been strongest," Jack said. "From what you have told me, that would be the living room." We agreed, and Jack began setting up. He placed candles in the four corners of the room, creating a small circle of salt in the center of the floor. In the middle of the circle, he placed the mirror facing upward. He explained that the mirror would act as a conduit, drawing the entity's attention and forcing it to reveal itself. Once everything was ready, Jack turned to us. "This is your home, so you need to be the ones to call it out. You must show that you are not afraid, that you are ready to take back control. When the time comes, speak to it directly. Do not show fear, and do not let it intimidate you." Marianne and I exchanged a nervous glance but nodded in agreement. We were in this together, and we were determined to see it through. Jack lit the candles and began chanting softly, words in a language I did not recognize. The air in the room grew heavy, and a low hum filled the space, similar to the one we had heard before. The temperature dropped sharply, and the familiar cold settled in. I could feel the woman's presence, stronger than ever before. Then the flickering candles cast eerie shadows across the walls, and the mirror in the center of the room began to tremble. The hum grew louder, almost like a growl, reverberating through my chest. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and every fiber of my being was screaming at me to run. But I stood my ground, knowing that this was our only chance to rid ourselves of this nightmare. Suddenly, the mirror cracked, and a dark, swirling mist began to rise from it. The mist coalesced into a figure, the woman in black. She stood within the circle of salt, her form more solid than ever before. Her dark eyes locked onto mine, filled with a hatred so intense it took my breath away. Marianne gripped my hand tightly, and I could feel her trembling. "We have to do this," I whispered to her, squeezing her hand in reassurance. With a deep breath, I stepped forward, my voice surprisingly steady as I spoke. "You are not welcome here. This is our home, and you have no power over us. Leave now and never return." The woman's eyes narrowed, and the room seemed to darken as she stepped forward, testing the boundaries of the salt circle. For a moment, I feared that it would not hold, that she would break free and overwhelm us. But Jack continued his chanting, louder now, more forceful, and the woman was pushed back into the center of the circle. She let out a piercing scream, a sound that shook the walls and sent chills down my spine. The candles flickered wildly, and the room felt like it was spinning, but I held my ground. "Leave!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the room. "You have no power here." Marianne joined in, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Leave us alone. You are not welcome here." The woman in black writhed in the center of the circle, her form distorting and twisting as if she was being torn apart. The mist around her grew thicker, swirling faster, until she was barely visible. The candles flared, and then, all at once, the mist imploded, collapsing in on itself and disappearing into the mirror. The room fell silent. The oppressive cold lifted, replaced by a warmth that felt almost soothing. The candles burned steadily, and the mirror lay cracked, but still in the center of the circle. The woman in black was gone. Jack let out a long breath and finally broke the silence. "It is over," he said, his voice calm but firm. "She is gone." Marianne and I collapsed into each other's arms, overwhelmed with relief. The tension that had gripped us for so long finally began to ease, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like we could breathe again. Jack helped us clean up, carefully disposing of the mirror and the other items he had used. Before he left, he gave us one final piece of advice. "Stay vigilant," he said. "Sometimes these things can try to come back, but as long as you remain strong and do not give in to fear, you will be safe." We thanked him, more grateful than words could express, and watched as he drove away into the night. The house was quiet now, peaceful, and I felt a sense of closure that I had not expected. Whatever the woman in black had been, whatever had drawn her to us, she was gone. We were finally free. As we stood in the doorway, looking out into the calm night, Marianne squeezed my hand. "Do you think it is really over?" she asked softly. I nodded, feeling a deep sense of certainty. "Yes, it is over. We are safe now." We went back inside, closing the door behind us. The house felt different, lighter, as if a dark cloud had finally lifted. And as we settled into bed that night, I knew that we had faced something terrifying and come out the other side stronger than before. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together without fear. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal. The house, once filled with dread, now felt like home again. The children, who had never fully understood what was happening, played happily, and Marianne and I found ourselves laughing and smiling more than we had in months. The oppressive weight that had hung over us was gone, and in its place was a sense of peace we had almost forgotten. But even as we settled back into our routines, a small part of me remained cautious. I could not shake the memory of the woman in black, her malevolent presence still lingering at the edges of my mind. Every now and then, I would catch myself listening for the faintest sound or looking over my shoulder just to be sure. But nothing happened. The house was quiet, and the fear that had gripped us was a distant memory. One evening, as we were getting ready for bed, Marianne turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think we should talk to the kids about what happened?" she asked. I hesitated, considering her question. "I am not sure," I admitted. "They were so young, and we did our best to shield them from it. I do not know if bringing it up now would do more harm than good." She nodded, understanding my concern. "Maybe you are right, but I just feel like we should be prepared, just in case. Well, just in case something happens again." I knew what she meant. The fear of the unknown, the possibility that the woman in black might return, still lingered at the back of our minds. But I also knew that living in fear was no way to live. We had already spent too much time being afraid. "I think we will be okay," I said, trying to sound confident. "We did everything we could, and Jack was certain she was gone. But if anything does happen, we will deal with it together, like we always do." Marianne smiled, her eyes soft with affection. "You are right. We have been through so much, and we came out stronger. Whatever happens, we will face it together." That night, as we lay in bed, I felt a deep sense of contentment. The nightmare was over, and our lives were back on track. I drifted off to sleep, feeling more at peace than I had in a long time.